Imagine standing at the edge of a hole in the ground so large it could swallow a house. The air around you smells like burning. The sound coming from below is not a roar, it is something lower, something older. A deep, steady exhale, like the earth itself is breathing. And the fire. The fire has been burning since before you were born. Since before your parents were young. It was burning when men walked on the moon. It was burning when the Soviet Union collapsed. It burned through wars, through famines, through the birth and death of entire governments. And tonight, right now, as you listen to these words, it is still burning. Alone. In the dark. In the middle of one of the most desolate deserts on the planet. No one lit it as a ceremony. No one maintains it. No one can put it out. This is the Darvaza Gas Crater. And the story of how it came to exist is stranger than anything Hollywood has ever invented. Before we go any further, I want you to picture something. It is 1971. The Cold War is at its height. The Soviet Union is the most powerful empire on Earth, or at least, it very much wants you to believe that. And deep in the heart of Soviet Central Asia, in a desert so remote that most maps barely acknowledged it existed, a team of Soviet geologists has set up camp. They are here for one reason. Natural gas. The Soviet Empire ran on energy, and the Karakum Desert was rumored to sit on enormous reserves. The geologists drilled. The equipment hummed. Everything seemed routine. And then, without any warning at all, the ground disappeared beneath them. Not slowly. Not with time to react. The entire drilling platform, the machinery, the equipment, the structure they had spent weeks assembling, dropped straight down into the earth. A massive underground cavern had been hidden just below the surface, and the weight of the drilling operation had punched straight through the ceiling. The geologists scrambled back. No one died, they were lucky, extraordinarily lucky, but what they left behind was an open wound in the earth, a gaping hole nearly the size of a football field, and from its depths, a sound they had never heard before. A deep, constant hiss. Natural gas, pouring upward in enormous quantities, flooding the air above the crater. And here is where the decision was made that would echo for the next half-century and beyond. The engineers looked at the gas pouring out of that hole and they made a calculation. Methane is colorless and odorless, but in high enough concentrations it is lethal. It can suffocate animals. It can drift toward villages. It can ignite without warning from a single spark. The cloud building above the crater was dangerous. The simplest solution, the engineers decided, was to burn it off. Light it on fire. Let it consume itself. They estimated the underground pocket was small, a few weeks of burning at most, and it would extinguish itself naturally. Someone climbed to the edge of that crater with something to make a flame. And they lit it. The fire started immediately. It was bright and hungry and it consumed the gas pouring upward with a roar that echoed across the empty desert. The engineers packed their equipment and left, satisfied that the problem was solved. They would return in a few weeks to a cold, empty crater, the gas burned away, the land ready for further exploration. They never came back. Because the fire never went out. A few weeks passed. Then a few months. The seasons changed. And the crater burned. Reports were filed somewhere in Soviet bureaucracy and quietly forgotten. The political machinery of the USSR ground on, indifferent. And the fire, patient and ancient and indifferent to all of it, kept burning. What those engineers had not understood, what no one understood at the time, was the scale of what lay beneath them. The Karakum Desert does not sit on a small pocket of natural gas. It sits on one of the largest natural gas reserves ever discovered on the surface of this planet. The crack they had created had not tapped into a finite bubble. It had opened a channel into something that stretched for kilometers in every direction, deep into the earth, effectively limitless on any human timescale. There was no bottom. There was no end. The fuel would not run out in weeks. It would not run out in years. It would not run out in decades. And as the Soviet Union slowly crumbled and finally collapsed in 1991, the new nation of Turkmenistan inherited the desert, inherited the gas reserves, and inherited a burning hole in the ground that had by then been on fire for 20 years, with no sign of stopping. For most of the 1990s, the crater existed in a kind of official invisibility. The new Turkmen government had more pressing concerns than an old Soviet accident in the middle of the desert. There were no roads leading to it on any tourist map. There were no signs. There was no infrastructure. There was just the desert, and the fire, and the occasional local who knew it was there. Nomadic Turkmen herders who moved their livestock through the region had their own relationship with the crater. They gave it space. Their animals refused to go near it. At night, the glow on the horizon was a landmark, something to navigate by and something to avoid. The name that emerged from these communities was not scientific. It was not bureaucratic. It was visceral and immediate. The door to hell. A place where the boundary between the surface world and whatever lay beneath had been torn open and never repaired. Then the internet changed everything. In the mid-2000s, the first photographs taken by backpackers and independent travelers began circulating online. A perfectly circular hole in the earth, glowing orange, alone in an empty desert at night. The images looked fake. They looked like concept art, like something a film studio had constructed for a science fiction movie. But they were real, and people could not stop sharing them. Within a few years, the Darvaza crater had become one of the most recognizable geological curiosities on the planet. Travel blogs described the journey to reach it: hours of driving on unmarked desert roads, camping in the open sand, waking up to a horizon lit by fire. Adventure tourists began making the trip specifically to see it. And as the images spread, something interesting began to happen to the people who looked at them. They felt something. Something uncomfortable and hard to name. The sight of a fire burning alone in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, for longer than most living humans have been alive, triggers something deep and instinctive. It feels wrong. It feels like something that should not exist. And that feeling, it turns out, is almost impossible to look away from. But here is the part of the story that most people never hear. In 2013, a man named George Karounis decided to do something that no one had ever done before. He decided to go inside. Karounis was a Canadian explorer and storm chaser, a man whose career was built around going to places that most people ran away from. He partnered with National Geographic and spent months planning the descent. A special heat-resistant suit was constructed. A climbing team was assembled. A rope system was designed to lower him past the flames burning along the crater walls and down to the floor, where no human being had ever stood. The team traveled to Turkmenistan. They set up their equipment at the edge of the crater. And on a night in November, with the flames burning around him and the heat pressing against his suit from every direction, George Karounis was lowered into the door to hell. What he found at the bottom was not ash. It was not bare rock. It was not the sterile, burned-out floor you might expect from a place that has been on fire for decades. At the bottom of the Darvaza crater, in an environment of extreme heat, toxic gases, and almost no oxygen, George Karounis found life. Bacteria. Microorganisms that had no business existing in such conditions, organisms that science calls extremophiles, life forms that have adapted to environments that would kill anything else. These bacteria were not just surviving in the crater. They were thriving. They were found nowhere in the surrounding desert soil, which meant they had not simply fallen in from outside. They belonged there. They were native to an environment that, by every standard measure, should have been completely hostile to life. Scientists who later analyzed the samples described their existence as deeply surprising. The implications, they said quietly, were significant for our understanding of where life can and cannot exist, including, potentially, on other planets. Think about that for a moment. Inside a crater that has been burning since 1971, in a desert in Central Asia, at the bottom of what people call the door to hell, there is life. It is not the life we recognize. It does not look like anything familiar. But it is there, persisting, adapting, completely indifferent to the fire burning above it. If life can find a way in a place like that, the question of where else it might exist begins to feel very different. Back on the surface, the political situation around the crater had been slowly shifting. The Turkmen government, which for decades had treated the crater as an embarrassing accident best ignored, began to reconsider its position as international attention grew. In 2010, President Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov visited the site in person and publicly ordered that it be studied for possible gas extraction and eventually closed. His reasoning was practical: the gas burning away in that crater represented enormous economic value, and Turkmenistan, despite its gas reserves, was not a wealthy country. Engineers were commissioned. Studies were conducted. Plans were drawn up. And then, quietly, without any official announcement, the plans were shelved. The technical challenges of sealing an underground cavity of unknown geometry, in unstable desert terrain, with active gas flow from multiple directions, were simply too great. The risk of causing a larger collapse, or a more dangerous and uncontrolled release, was real. The safest option, experts concluded off the record, was to leave it alone. In 2022, the new president, Berdimuhamedov's son, Serdar, who had inherited both the country and his father's unresolved problem, repeated the order to extinguish the crater. The same studies were revisited. The same conclusions were quietly reached. As of today, the fire is still burning. It will almost certainly still be burning tomorrow. And the year after that. There is a version of this story that is simply about an industrial accident and its unintended consequences. A drilling team made a mistake, and that mistake has been burning for over 50 years. That version is true, as far as it goes. But there is another version, one that sits underneath the facts like the gas sits underneath the desert. This is a story about the gap between human intention and human outcome. About the way the earth absorbs our mistakes and makes them permanent. About the strange and unsettling fact that we can create things we cannot uncreate. The Soviet engineers who lit that fire were solving a problem. They were being practical, efficient, reasonable. They could not have imagined that their solution would still be visible from space more than half a century later. They could not have imagined that people from the other side of the world would one day travel thousands of kilometers just to stand at the edge of what they had made and feel afraid. The Karakum Desert is one of the quietest places on Earth. On a clear night, away from the crater, the silence is absolute: no traffic, no wind, no human sound of any kind. Just the stars above and the sand below and the vast indifference of the natural world. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, you see it. A glow on the horizon. Orange and steady and ancient. You walk toward it without quite deciding to. And the closer you get, the more the sound builds, the low, constant, breathing sound that is not like any fire you have ever heard before. You reach the edge and you look down. The walls are alive with flame. The floor is distant and hot and strange. And somewhere down there, in conditions that should not support life, something is living. You can stand at this edge. People do, every year. They camp beside it. They watch it through the night. They describe the experience in ways that are remarkably consistent across cultures, languages, and backgrounds. There is awe. There is unease. There is something that feels almost like recognition, as if some part of you, some very old part, understands what you are looking at without needing it explained. A fire that was not meant to exist. A wound that was not meant to be permanent. A door that was never supposed to be opened. It is still open. It is still burning. And in the silence of the Karakum Desert, 54 years after a team of engineers made a calculation and struck a match, the earth is still exhaling,